Welcome back. I love all you prompt people. Rate it 2. This is good. Great job. I think some more folks are making their way in, and I'll ask our next panel to come on up to the front of the room and make their way to the stage. There are, again, 2 other panels going on upstairs. This is the correlations between human and environmental health. So while our panelists are coming up, don't want to rush you, but I will welcome the health plenary panelists to the stage, and we have 2 co-moderators with us this afternoon, Dr. Chelsea Rochman and Dr. Kayleigh Wyles. Come on up. Dr. Rochman is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. She has a PhD in ecology with an emphasis on marine ecology, environmental chemistry, and ecotoxicology. Dr. Wyles is an environmental psychology lecturer at the University of Surrey. So you're getting a great mix of both the physical toxicology and the mental health sciences in this discussion. So looking forward to a lively panel, and I will pass this off to.
Great. Okay. Awesome. I'm going to actually stand up to start it off because I feel strange sitting down. So I'm going to start off the session. Kayleigh and I are going to tag team, both being in the panel and also moderating the panel. So we'll see how that goes. And I'd like to actually start this panel or this discussion from a perspective about 11 years ago. Some of you may be familiar with this article. It came out in 2006. It was a Pulitzer Prize-winning article written by Ken Weiss in the Los Angeles Times. And in my opinion, it was really the article that introduced, remember, the garbage patch in the North Pacific to the world, which was discovered by Captain Charles Moore in 1996, 10 years prior. So in this article, Ken Weiss went through this list of facts that we knew about plastic pollution in the ocean at that time. So I want to talk a little bit about what we knew then versus what we know now, and then we'll get to the health part. And so in terms of what we knew then, a lot of this stuff is similar. Most of the plastic that's floating, or most of the marine debris, that we find in the environment is plastic. That is still true today. At this time, they suggested that the majority of it, about 80%, comes from land. Yep, Jenna Jambeck confirmed that, and she's even told us that about 8 million metric tons comes off of the coast every year. What has changed is that at this time, 46,000 pieces of plastic litter floating on the surface of the ocean per square mile was the amount that we thought was out there then. Today, that number is about 7 times that. But what's really changed in this conversation is about the ubiquity of this material. So at the time, we were talking about the North Pacific gyre, the garbage patch. Then with the work of Anna Cummins and Marcus Erickson at 5 gyres, they showed us it's not just in the Pacific Ocean, it's actually the 5 garbage patches in all major open oceans. And then researchers and citizen scientists all over the world showed us it's not just about the oceans, it's right here in Charleston, it's in freshwater, it's floating on the surface, but also at the bottom of the oceans, from the poles to the equator, it's in Arctic sea ice, it's coming down with rain, and it contaminates hundreds of species of animals, and these numbers are consistently changing. That bottom number is how many species have been demonstrated to eat microplastic in the wild. And so that's where this human health issue starts in terms of seafood. Because we now know that we find plastic in seafood products when we go to the store. This includes fish, this includes shellfish, and it even includes sea salt. So the FAO has recently taken this issue seriously in terms of food security, thinking about how does microplastic disrupt the amount of fish stocks, food availability, how might it disrupt our seafood in terms of being a safe food, and is it nutritious? So we're going to talk a lot about that today, but then we also have a unique perspective from Kayleigh Wyles, who's an environmental psychologist, who's going to tell us about mental health and how our behaviors cause plastic and how that plastic pollution affects our health. So I was going to do actually an introduction to our panel, but luckily it was done for me, which saves me some time. But here is our panel. And so Dr. Pat Fair is going to talk to us about environmental contaminants in marine mammals and how they can be considered sentinels for human health. I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem in terms of what we know related to seafood. Dr. John Weinstein is an aquatic toxicologist. He's going to talk about the sources, fate, and impacts right here in the Charleston Harbor. And then Kayleigh is going to talk about mental health. So I'm going to kick it off. We are all going to be like a fire hose of information at first, so we've each got a few minutes to give you kind of what we know. And then we're going to slow down. We're going to talk a little bit about the challenges. We're going to talk about the complex solutions to this complex problem, which I think is the diversity of solutions. We've heard about lots of them today. We'll continue to hear about lots of them, lying all along that life cycle assessment of plastic. And then we're going to hopefully have enough time to give you some opportunities to ask us questions. So I'm going to start my portion with this picture again, saying that yes, unfortunately, when I eat seafood, I am sure that I am exposing myself to plastic pollution. If we look at the populations of animals that are sampled, so oftentimes if I go in the field and I sample a bunch of mussels, or I go to the fish market and other people, these are actually other people's data, they're finding plastic sometimes in the majority of animals that they purchase. So we can take that data, we can take information on how much seafood people eat, and we can actually estimate what our exposure is, right, under certain scenarios. And so the Food and Agricultural Organization convened a group very recently to say, how does this impact those 3 pillars of food security? So I was recently at a workshop in Rome. We looked at how do the ecological impacts of plastic, how might those impact fish stocks, so food abundance? Then we also looked at, in terms of physical toxicity and chemical toxicity, what might be at risk in terms of food safety. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to go into great detail of any of it, but I'd be happy to answer more questions later. What we can say is the first question is, how does plastic affect fish stocks? When I've recently gone into the literature and looked at people's research and asking these questions about the ecological impacts, we do see demonstrated evidence of toxicological impacts in animals who are exposed to plastic. And this is at many levels of biological organization. So what do I mean by that? It can impact an organism. It can hurt their cells. It can cause cancer. It can also cause death. It can impact a population in a lab in terms of if I feed an animal plastic, I can see reduced fecundity, meaning they lay less eggs may hatch, and then you see reduced survival of the offspring. And people have also dosed communities or assemblages of species and seen differences in terms of how many of those animals in each species there are, so changes in community structure. So asking that question about how plastics may impact fish stocks is worthwhile, and we should continue to do that research. In terms of toxicity to humans, the biggest question is, when I eat plastic, does it come out the other end? So not to be crude, but do I poop it out? If it's greater than 150 micron, the average size of a microbead, I probably will. If it's smaller, research shows that those materials can actually go out of our gut and into our bloodstream. And if it is small enough in the nano range, less than 1.5 micron, it has access to all organs. So I can't tell you what that does to a human body, but there's a lot of research in the medical literature that can give us an idea. And so we know that we can see cell death, we can see inflammation, the beginning stages of tumor promotion from surgical materials that are made out of plastic. So we have a long way to go, but we should continue to look further into this research using what we know in the medical field to make hypotheses for future research projects. And then there's this chemical portion. We hear an awful lot about how plastics are cocktails of chemicals and how those chemicals may transfer to animals when they're ingested. Plastics are made out of a unique cocktail of chemicals, and Pat's going to tell us more about that. When they enter the ocean, those chemicals can leach out into the water, and when an animal eats it, they can leach out into the wildlife. So in my own work, I have found that fish in the middle of the South Atlantic have flame retardants associated with them that seem to be correlated with the microplastics in the area. Similar trends have been found by Hideshige Takada, as well as Wanjun Shim in Korea. And so it is possible that plastics could be transferring chemicals into our food chain. But to what extent? Again, we don't know. So there's a lot more research to be done. And my long-term goal is that in sometime soon we can actually take this data and put it into these amazing programs like Good Catch here at South Carolina Aquarium, also the Seafood Watch program at Monterey Bay, and the Ocean-Wise program at Vancouver, to be able to say something about seafood safety in terms of plastic, but we've got a long way to go. So we're going to learn more about some of the research that's going on. I'm going to hand it over to you guys, and I went a little over, and I'm sorry, but that means you can too.
So I'm John Weinstein. I'm a professor of biology at the Citadel, and my research laboratory at the Citadel has been involved in looking at plastics and microplastics in Charleston Harbor for about the last 5 years or so. And the idea struck me that there was a need to study the plastic and microplastic problem in Charleston. About 5 years ago, every single day in the newspaper, there were articles about the garbage patch. And I was wondering, what is the extent of that problem in Charleston itself? And so I need to recognize my collaborators from Clemson University who have been a part of this, and I also need to recognize South Carolina Sea Grant, who's funded much of this research. And so in terms of microplastics and how they might be affecting organisms in the environment, we wanted to say something about the sources, and we wanted to say something about their eventual effects in the environment. And so one of the potential sources is the plastic debris, the large plastic items, the single-use items that you see lying around the harbor. So we wanted to get a handle on how much plastic debris there was in Charleston Harbor. So what we did was we teamed up with South Carolina Beach Sweep, River Sweep. In September of 2013, there were 8 stations around Charleston Harbor, and we teamed up at each station. We had graduate students and myself at one of those stations. And for all those volunteers who were bringing in the trash, we categorized it as plastic and non-plastic. And then for the plastic items, we further categorized it by type of plastic, and we weighed it all. And so what we found were the highest levels of plastic debris were associated with the population center of Charleston. It was right here downtown. In fact, it was Waterfront Park. For those of you who are familiar with Charleston, Waterfront Park had the highest levels of plastic debris. We found that the most common items were bottle caps, beverage bottles, and styrofoam cups and plates, and the clamshells you get at takeout. Those were the top 3. And this was unique compared to other sites. If you look at the International Coastal Cleanup data set, because there are beach sweeps that happen globally, Charleston is unique because of the large proportion of foam products. Okay? And then the average we calculated, 0.92 items per meter. If you were to walk around Charleston Harbor and assuming that the debris was spread evenly, every 2 steps you would come across another plastic item in the harbor. And so using these numbers, we estimate that there are 460,900 plastic debris items weighing, you see, 6922 kilograms. That's 15,260 pounds on the shores of Charleston Harbor. And you've heard that number a couple times today. That's 7.5 tons of plastic. That's just on the shoreline. I'm sure there's a lot more underneath the harbor that we can't see. We then did a survey of microplastics, and we found microplastics everywhere we looked. We found it in the surface water, we found it in the intertidal sediments, we found it in the subtidal sediments, we found it in the salt marshes. Microplastics are pervasive in the harbor. In the water, we found on average 11 particles per liter. That's about 40 particles per gallon of water, the surface water, okay, from microplastics. And we found that microplastic fibers dominated the water. For the sediments, we found 36.1 particles per kilogram, and it was the fragments that dominated, not the fibers. The sources of these microplastics were surprising. We thought that the microplastic particles would be associated with the single-use plastic items that we were finding on the shoreline. They were not. The majority of microplastic particles that we found were black, small particles, and we've recently identified them as tire wear particles. Okay, so it's tire treads. As people drive around, the tire treads are wearing off and making its way into Charleston Harbor. Microbeads. There's been a lot of attention on microbeads. These are the manufactured small particles that are put in consumer products that have recently been banned with the Microbead Free Waters Act. We only found 1% of the microplastics in Charleston Harbor to be microbeads. We then looked at plastic degradation. So we have all this plastic debris lying on the shorelines. How quickly is that degrading? And conventional wisdom will tell you that it takes decades to centuries for plastics to degrade. What is really unknown is how quickly does that degradation process begin? And so that's what we studied here in Charleston Harbor. We found that very quickly, within days, a biofilm grows on the plastic, and that organisms will begin to use this biofilm. So we have snails, periwinkles grazing on the plastic material, And then after about 8 to 12 weeks, we have encrusting invertebrates. Hard substrates are hard to come by in Charleston Harbor, so organisms will use this debris as habitat. So what we found, and this was surprising, that microplastics are produced from the plastic debris between 4 and 8 weeks after that plastic has been set out into the marsh. Okay? And the process was surprising. We thought, reading the literature, that the fragmentation of plastics happens. So you have one piece of plastic, it breaks into 2 smaller pieces, and then 4 even smaller pieces. That's not what's happening. It's a delamination process. So the microplastics are delaminating. They're emitting off the surface. Okay? So here you have 7.5 tons of plastic debris sitting on the shoreline, and anything that's been out there more than 4 weeks is producing these microplastic particles. And so using some estimates we had in the laboratory based on plastic that we had set out and studied in the marsh, we estimate that a single 9-inch diameter foam plate in the marsh would, over its lifetime as it degraded, produce 46,354 particles. That is enough to contaminate each mile shoreline in Charleston Harbor with 151 particles. And again, we have 7.5 tons sitting out there producing these microplastic particles. We've also done laboratory exposures, and to the organisms we've exposed to microplastics, they readily ingest them. Sarah Oh at Clemson University has been looking at copepods, and she's found developmental effects on copepods. They develop and grow a lot slower in the presence of microplastics. We've been exposing, in my laboratory, grass shrimp to microplastics, and we find that microplastics are readily ingested by grass shrimp. They're indiscriminate eaters, and they will eat these things like popcorn and fill their gut. And you see some images there of shrimp with their guts filled with these microplastic particles. Over here on the right side, those are the tire particles. So grass shrimp eat tire particles as well. All right. And we've also looked at some persistent organic pollutants that adsorb to the surface of these microplastics, and we find that as these invertebrates ingest these particles, the contaminants desorb into the tissues of the organisms. And with that, I will turn it over to Pat.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank everybody for coming and the interest and the organizers for this really important topic. I'm going to move on to talking a little more about the chemicals that are in these plastics. We're all exposed to chemicals daily. They're pervasive in our environment, unfortunately. And the concern is over very susceptible populations like infants and children. A study in 2005 actually detected 287 toxic chemicals in cord blood. Totally unacceptable. Topics I'm going to talk about in the short time I have is several of the chemicals that are found in plastics. PBDEs, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, flame retardant chemicals, triclosan, bisphenol A, and also perfluorinated chemicals. So what we've looked at and heard a lot about is the entanglement and the ingestion of plastics. The chemical exposures are much more insidious. Certainly, we're not going to find them as whole bottles here. Back in 1962, Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, which actually sparked the environmental revolution. I'll give away my age because I remember reading this. This was high school and college reading material, which really highlighted the effects of DDT. Back then, it was the chemical companies touting better living through chemistry. And in her book here, the unintended consequences, which was really highlighted, spurred the revolution for environmental concerns. Since then, with the increase in chemicals, there have been a number of books out there as well as documentaries and movies. So there is a lot of information, there's a lot of concern out there about chemical contaminant exposures. When we look at the chemicals we're talking about, they tend to be in the halogen family there, with the fluorine, chlorine, and bromine. And then, of course, the bisphenol and the phthalates. And these chemicals aren't inert. Their exposures have a lot to do with systems and diseases, and also on a gene level. And particularly of concern are the EDC, endocrine disrupting properties of these chemicals, that they can alter the hormones that are responsible for development and growth, immune function, thyroid function. We'll talk a little bit about BPA, which are found in a wide variety of plastics, food lining, the lining of canned food, cash register receipts, safety gear. But now, fortunately, we can start finding BPA-free plastics as well as canned food. Back in 2012, FDA banned BPA from infant bottles. And I'm really glad my grandson was born last year, so he's not exposed to these in his baby bottles. But we find this, it's been reported in 95% of the adult US population, has a lot of effects that have been studied in animals and epidemiology studies. Little on flame retardant chemicals. These are flame retardant chemicals that are put in consumer products to reduce the inflammability. But unfortunately, they're persistent, they bioaccumulate, and they're toxic. We talk about a little bit of perfluorinated chemicals and how long they last in the environment. If we compare that to BPA, which is basically a couple days, meaning if you stop consuming products that have BPA, you can reduce your contaminant body burden. DDT is a much longer time, and the perfluorinated chemicals much longer. So when we talk about the perfluorinated chemicals, we can find these in the Teflon pans, rain protection, because they're nonstick, they're water resistant, and they're used in many, many consumer products. Fast food wrappers, so your fast food doesn't stick to it. Popcorn, and in carpets and sofa, the upholstery. So PFCs are linked with cancer, liver, kidney disease, and a bunch of endocrine disrupting properties. So what do popcorn, dolphins, polar bears, and you have in common? You all carry this industrial toxicant, perfluorinated chemicals. It makes life very convenient. So to reduce our exposures, we avoid the labels with anything perfluoro, and we look for manufactured products without them. I'm going to talk a little bit about PFCs in Charleston, bringing it back home here. We started a health assessment study with bottlenose dolphins here in 2003, looking at our local dolphin population and comparing it to the animals in the Indian River Lagoon in Florida. So we were able to capture 360 dolphins at both sites and do a complete health assessment, and we found out a host of information on the diseases that they carry as well as their pollutants. We found out that the Charleston animals have higher levels than any other marine mammal, as high as occupationally exposed workers. And we also found associations between the levels in their blood and immune alterations. which, as sentinels for the environment, we started looking at our local environment, and we looked at the sediments. And here we found out that the sediments in Charleston Harbor were higher than any other U.S. urban area. It was higher than Detroit and Baltimore, San Francisco. And we had hot spots. If you look here at the harbor and the three river systems, you can see there are some high levels and some low levels, because these products are used in so many consumer products. So we really have found the perfluorinated chemicals in a top-level predator, flame retardant chemicals, and also triclosan, which is an antimicrobial. It was the first study published showing that these marine mammals have levels that are detectable in their blood. So we call our animals here water, stain, and fireproof, which isn't a good thing. Triclosan, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. It's used in over 2,000 products, starting from toothpaste to soap products to plastics. In 2016, FDA finally banned the use of triclosan in hand soaps. After studying it for many, many years, they decided that, and they concurred with the scientific studies that showed using soap was just as effective. And I was pleased to be part of a scientific consensus statement that will be published next month in Environmental Health Perspectives that looks at triclosan and lists all the reasons why we shouldn't be using these products from a scientific standpoint. So you may ask, all these chemicals, why? Why are we so chemical laden? Basically, none are required to be tested for negative health impacts unless there's harmful effects that have been shown after they're already in use. So what we don't practice in this country is basically what's termed a precautionary principle. In terms of that, even if we don't know all the relationships between the harmful effects of these chemicals, we shouldn't be using them. Unfortunately, we don't operate by this principle. So I put up here what I call my 3 R's, is to reduce use, reduce exposure, and reduce risk. So get the message out to become ocean champions. Reduce the use of toxic chemicals and plastics. So if you're reducing your plastic use, you're also doing good things for yourself, as well as everything else that swims and flies and crawls. And we've heard this morning, you have a lot of power to use in what you purchase. If you're not buying these products with chemicals in it, they're going to reduce them. And there's a whole bunch of websites out there that are very informative, that they distill the science, but they do it very accurately. And I've listed several here.
Brilliant, thank
Yeah.
you. So I'll briefly talk about the mental health implications, and then we'll go on to some questions between us as a panel. And so I'd like to first of all say thank you very much for inviting me to come and join and contribute to this very enthusiastic and inspirational summit. And today we'll talk a little bit more about the negative parts of marine plastics and why we need to focus on it, and then we'll end on some nice positive points as well. So, start with some nice depressing pictures, something which we already know, and I think everybody here would agree, we don't like litter. It's ugly, it's not liked, people will actively avoid it if they can.
And I think this might link in with some of the points which was in the previous session, I think in one of the other rooms earlier, that it's costly, it's expensive. So whilst we've already looked a bit about more the consumption of like seafood, which might have marine plastics inside, when it comes to the visual side of things and recreational users, they go to the beach, and if there's litter there, they don't like it. And one thing that the tourist industry will try to do is get people to still come. So because of that, it costs a lot of money to, first of all, remove the litter. So these are just some examples. Sorry, some of the examples are from the UK. But there's also evidence that in the US, it's expensive to clear. And also when people go somewhere else, so displacement, because they don't want to go to a beach covered in rubbish, then you're losing that tourism revenue as well. So on the kind of health implications of that, there's kind of two sides of things. And the reason why I got into it in the first place is I asked the general public and also coastal experts to basically identify what is one key issue which is facing the coast when it comes to recreational users. And I was kind of hoping for them to say issues like littering and when it comes to like rockpool rambling, exploring the wildlife and threats to individual species. The coastal experts did talk about these very ecology side of things, but when it came to the general public, they would mention stuff saying about it's bad for the environment, but they also tied in the impact it has on them. So emphasizing that it ruins the way people experience the environment, it's an eyesore, it's ugly, and they just don't like it. So looking at that a bit further, we already know that there are physical risks associated with this, so standing on a bit of glass is not going to be exactly nice. When it comes to other things like sewage-related debris, then there's the risks when it comes to other contamination, sharp objects. Don't exactly want to go swimming when you can see some of this evidence. And also entanglement. So you've seen lots of pictures of seals and other organisms entangled, but it also affects us in terms of our boats, but also us personally when you go swimming, divers and stuff also have these threats. So there's the physical health side of things. As a psychologist, I'm looking at the mental health and well-being effects. So going back to the more positive, the coast and the marine environment has numerous benefits associated with it. So by living by the sea or just visiting or even looking at an image of the sea can have numerous benefits. So it can reduce your heart rate, improve your blood pressure, as well as making you feel happy and enjoying those moments. So that's when you go to a pristine environment. But when it comes to litter, people often leave litter after going to the coast. And this actually has a knock-on effect on the visitors themselves. So doing some other studies, we found that it actually has detrimental effects to our mental health and well-being. So rather than just saying, oh, it has less beneficial, it actually makes us feel, for example, more sad, angry, especially when it comes to the type of litter. Public-related litter often elicits lots of negative emotions, focusing on the culprit, showing carelessness and thoughtlessness, and just anger towards those people. So yeah, elicits these negative emotions. So that's a quick overview of the mental and psychological well-being impacts of marine plastics generally. And so what we'll now do, I guess, is move over to us for kind of a panel question and answer session. And I think at the moment we've talked quite negatively, and we already know, everybody here, that plastic is bad when it comes to the marine environment, when it shouldn't be there. So I guess we'll jump straight into what can we do about it. So I guess if you're happy, Pat, if I can pass straight over to you and say if you've already indicated a little bit on your slides.
I did.
What is the one action that you would push?
I think awareness would be number one. I don't think a lot of people may consider their exposures when they use consumer products. And we need to do a better job in making them aware of that. So then they can actually exercise their buying power and reduce their chemical exposures. I know last time when I replaced carpet in my house, I specifically, and it wasn't easy to do, but it's getting more and more products are becoming available that don't have flame retardant chemicals. You can look and you can purchase those.
Perfect. John, what would you say?
I would agree with awareness. And, you mentioned Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. I think we need a Silent Spring for plastics. People know about the Great Garbage Patch, but I don't think it elicits an emotional, visceral response that then translates into consumer behaviors. And so if we could have a novel, or we could have a movie that became part of the popular culture and got people talking about plastics and the impacts of plastics, and raise the awareness, make it visceral, and then everybody has 2 votes. You vote for your elected officials who can enact change, and then you also vote every time you go to the grocery store and buy products. So if we get people, exercising both votes, I think that will go far in helping to solve the problem.
So I'm going to go big. I think local solutions are great, and I'm all about it, but I think that they're hard to do. So I recently had an experience at the United Nations where different member countries who come from the developing world would say, oh, this is great, we want to do something locally, but we don't have the foundation to do it, we need help. And so I think we need some type of UN international agreement that lays a framework by which we can get sound waste management infrastructure into the developing world. And I think if this agreement said something like, we're not going to import and sell products that don't have a sustainable end-of-life solution. So let's say, for example, if I were to exercise this in my city, I used to live in Davis, California. We could only recycle polyethylene and polypropylene. So in the store, I could only buy polyethylene and polypropylene. That would certainly incentivize people to say, well, we need the waste management, and maybe the plastics industry to say we need the waste management infrastructure on the floor in different places. So maybe we need some type of extended producer responsibility, a tax for plastic that then goes into this global fund to produce this infrastructure. So I think it's time that I think acting locally is amazing, but I also think we need some kind of international agreement to build a foundation in which we can more easily work locally upon.
Perfect. And I think I'll just chip in a little bit here and then maybe move on to the questions to the audience before I conclude. So I'll end on some other bits about citizen science as well. But linking with the awareness side of things and kind of being conscious that you need to address people's intrinsic motivation is kind of what we use as psychologists, focusing on what drives them. So when it comes to any financial incentives and stuff, you need to be careful that you're getting people's attention. So when it comes to, like in the UK, we've got the plastic bag charge. So they have to pay 5p for a plastic bag. It stops them in their tracks. It kind of breaks their habit because they're suddenly conscious of what they have to do and think about, and then they can start thinking about other things. But it's important to have that awareness side of things so that they are changing the behaviors and deciding what they're doing because of either their internal kind of processes, understanding the environmental implications, the health implications, rather than financial, because if you focus too much on the financial side of things, as soon as you take away the money side of things, then they can resort back to their behavior. So for long-term individual change, I think, yes, raise awareness and get people engaged. So I think we've got a couple of minutes for questions, and then we'll end on a empowering thing. So do we have a microphone available? We've got one coming over there.
This is a question that I just thought of as you were talking about adding in a price on the plastic bags. We've done that with bottles. The bottle deposit charge, the 5-cent charge per bottle that you buy. When you buy a 6-pack, it's added on. It's been in place for decades. Do you think that's made like a lasting impact on a reduction in purchasing of plastic bottles? And do you think that we would see the same effect with plastic bags? Or would we have to actually have the grocers saying to the guests, would you like to pay an extra 15 cents for your 3 plastic bags?
I think it would have definitely have an effect. And we've noticed that in the UK, so the plastic bags used. We've done it through stages, so I think it was Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, then England was slow and picked up. And with that, we saw that the use of plastic bags has dropped by about 80%. Within the past 5 years, bags washed up on our coast has reduced by 22%. So we are seeing change, but I guess when it comes to the long-term effects, if the scheme is then taken away, then it's important to have more of like a combined approach. So a lot of the interventions we've talked about today and kind of solutions is there's no one perfect solution. And in terms of that, it's good to combine it with something else. So have the incentive, but then have that extra bit of maybe awareness raising, have some information, get people engaged, as well as, and then that will just boost your chances of having a bigger effect, and maybe even spill over, have an effect on other behaviors, not just that one as well.
I was also wondering really quickly, Dr. Weinstein, you talked about the plastic in the harbor and how quickly the particles degenerate off of the main piece. I heard about a study that was done recently on the different chemical components that are in the water in the harbor, and I heard something about NSAIDs and pain relievers being in the water, also estrogen-type drugs from birth control. Are there any studies being done, or are there any plans for studies that look at the effects of those chemicals and their combined effects on the plastic that's in the harbor?
I don't know of any specific studies being done in Charleston Harbor. I know studies have been done elsewhere on those topics, and I know NOAA had a huge effort several years ago looking at pharmaceuticals within Charleston Harbor.
There was a student project that looked at the wastewater treatment plants and looking at discharge into the harbor. So there is, at least I know, one study that addressed that.
They're out there.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you for being here. I agree that to work locally is very, very important, but I also agree that it's time that we worked on a larger scale. And it's my understanding that the UN has started a Clean Oceans campaign, and I just wondered what effect you think this might have, and will the United States actually partake?
It's a great question. From my understanding of this Clean Seas campaign, and correct me if I'm wrong, if someone else that knows more about it, it's that countries can jump in and have an agreement of what they're going to do, which means it doesn't really have a ton of teeth, but that's what you could say about a lot of United Nations agreements, right? So I think it's a really great start. I think we need both. We need this bottom up, which is what we're all doing here, and then you need this top down. And so I think it's a great step. It's brought the issue to the United Nations. That's step one. And so this June, there's an oceans meeting with the United Nations for the Sustainable Development Goal number 14, I think it is. And so we'll see, what happens from there. But it's all great steps. If you look back on climate change, the first agreements where we notice it. The second agreement was we can do something if we want. The third agreement had teeth. So it's a great first step.
So one last question. Yep.
Yeah, Pat, in full disclosure, I was part of that 2013 Dolphin Health Assessment. And I seem to recall that there was the comment made in depth that female dolphins live about twice as long as male dolphins, and part of that is that female dolphins have babies at least once a year, but that the first time that she gives birth, in general, the baby dolphin dies because of the high load of toxins in its system that comes from the mother. So I think that is a reality, having been on a boat in the North Edisto River and watching a mother circling around her dead baby. It really left an impact on my husband and me. The other thing I'd like to ask is there a website which talks about, I'm constantly gathering various websites to look at myself, which talks about the various chemicals in our consumer products, such as triclosan, that we've discussed over several years, and other chemicals which are in consumer goods, the parabens and the phthalates, lead and mercury in various cosmetics, which you don't hear about unless you research personally. I was able to find out that my Sleep Number bed that I got to spend several $1,000s for has flame retardant in the memory foam, so this would also be almost every bed nowadays. And California no longer allows that to be in products sold there. So I called Sleep Number and requested that I get the topper from California to replace the one that I purchased here in South Carolina. And I was told, number one, by the person I spoke with that was not true. And then after I required that she speak to her manager and get back with me, was told that yes, indeed, it was true. She hadn't known that, but that they could not ship one to me from California because I wasn't a California resident and purchasing it there.
So I guess the question there is kind of where to find information
where
when it comes to
to find this, but I was even told that in organic mattresses, I just found this out a few weeks ago, that even in organic non-flame retardant mattresses, that they still have a flame retardant wrapping on them.
So Pat, do you?
Yes, you covered a wide area there, so I'll start with the bedding, I guess, and the flame retardant chemicals. Been working with Green Policy Institute, and they do a really nice job of distilling a lot of the science, and there's information on there regarding flame retardant chemicals. The problem that you raise is pretty pervasive because the truth in labeling is very difficult to find out what precisely is in some furniture. So you can make educated decisions on what you buy. At the same time, they are banning some of these products, at least certain congeners, and then they are replacing them with others that we still don't know any health information about. So it's this regrettable substitution is the term that's, we're substituting what we think may be less harmful chemicals, but we don't really know. So it is a difficult one, and to get at least labeling on the different products.
Perfect. And just to very quickly end on a positive note as well, why should we act now? I think we've all got numerous reasons for that, just based on our talks today. But one part of it is, or one selling pitch could be, it's also good for us. So us as volunteers, we can all do something. We've all learned about different techniques, and the previous session before this was about citizen science. And there are different schemes out there which I've started to look at the benefits and the impacts it has on the individuals themselves. One example I'll just very briefly overview is passive fishing for litter. This is a scheme in numerous countries where they get commercial fishers to bring back rubbish that they find in their nets during their normal day-to-day activities. And so with that, they're bringing back waste, we're measuring it, and to some extent seeing what is in it. And they've got numerous motives for the scheme itself. But one thing which we've looked at is that it actually has knock-on effects on the fishers. So they are learning about marine litter by this particular scheme, but it also has impacts on the behaviors. So just very quickly, one thing that we looked at is whether or not they change their behavior after joining this scheme, or comparing people who are part of the scheme compared to those who are not. And we find that the people who say that they're part of the fishing for litter scheme tend to bring back more waste that they catch compared to those who are not part of the scheme. Well, that's the point of the scheme, so that's not that surprising. But there are some other knock-on effects. Again, this is self-reported, so they might be being nice and trying to tell me what I want to hear. But they also do say that they tend to throw less waste overboard, which this is a big cultural thing when it comes to commercial fishers, especially, I guess, within the UK at least. So those fishers tend to not do that as much, and they also change their waste and management practices back at home as well. So this can be a form of spillover. You can encourage one behavior, and then that can knock on to other behaviors as well. When it comes to beach cleans, this is one thing that Christy hinted at earlier. There's been work looking at the impacts it has on the volunteers themselves. So by going to the coast, seeing litter, does that have a good impact on you or not when you're doing something about it? So we already know that litter is bad for our mental health and well-being, but actually doing something, what are the impacts? So we looked at numerous things. We looked at whether or not it changes their well-being. So this is how pleasurable or meaningful the experience is, and whether or not they learn about marine litter and marine issues more generally, and also their behavioral intention. So are they likely to do another beach clean in the future, and again, change other behaviors. And so with this, to be able to deduce that it was just beach cleans, we compared beach cleans with two other coastal activities. A rock pool ramble, so this was another citizen science aspect where people were exploring the biodiversity of bits of rocky shores, or a coastal walk as the most common activity done on the coast. And with that, we found that all activities had beneficial effects. Everybody found it pleasurable, and they all intended to do more pro-environmental behaviours. When it came to knowledge, it was the citizen science, as you kind of expect, who strengthened their awareness about marine issues. But the things which were unique for Beach Clean specifically, so they're all good because of doing these different activities, but Beach Clean specifically found it much more meaningful, which is a key thing when it comes to the well-being side of things, because it's more enriching and you're more likely to have more longer-term effects. Same with marine awareness, and you're more likely to do a beach clean again in the future. And so with this, you can take some certain bits of information from it. For example, the intention to do a beach clean. It's best to try to get people to pledge to do it straight away, because their intention to do a beach clean straight away after it was much higher, but then a week later they started to reduce their intentions. So like it is today, you might have all these aspirations and want to go forward, but when you go back into your real life, then it suddenly gets distracted by other factors. So I guess a key message really to say today from what we've kind of covered is don't stick your head in the sand, and you won't look as cute as that, to be aware of the problem, but also what you can do. And we can all do something. We've already talked, there's lots of different solutions. There's not one perfect one. So I guess kind of a personal ask of you would be just to think now, what is one thing that you would like to do? And don't keep it vague and I'll just do a beach clean. Give a specific time. When am I going to do it? Next week, next month? Where are you going to do it? So when it comes to recycling, I'm going to sort out more of my stuff in the kitchen and stuff like that. So I guess that's the kind of main message. We can all do it. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. That was a terrific discussion and sobering, but the happy note really was helpful toward the end. We're going to take another short break until our last panel of the day, which will be in 10 minutes at 3 o'clock. So feel free to enjoy the coffee break for just a few.